The air inside Judge Ronald Whitmore's courtroom was thick with tension, though no one dared to acknowledge it. It was an old, grand space, ornate wooden benches, towering shelves stacked with law books, and the glaring fluorescent lights that made everything feel colder than it was. The walls carried an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers and the sharp clack of the judge's gavel as he finalized yet another case. At the far end of the room, near the defense table, stood two young black women, identical in every way. Their deep brown skin glowed under the harsh lighting, and their sharp, intelligent eyes scanned the room with quiet confidence. Dressed in simple black blazers over fitted slacks, their posture was upright, almost military-like, shoulders squared, chins lifted, backs straight. Even with their composed expressions, anyone paying attention could sense something beneath their calm exterior, something restrained, something patient but not weak. Their names were Ayanna and Amara Brooks, twin sisters from Atlanta, Georgia, and today they stood before a judge who had already decided he did not like them. From the moment they entered the room, the shift in energy was unmistakable. Some jurors averted their gaze, while a few exchanged knowing smirks. Others whispered behind cupped hands, their murmurs barely concealed. The bailiff, a burly man with a stern face, seemed suddenly more rigid in his stance, and the court stenographer, a petite woman with silver-framed glasses, avoided eye contact altogether. It was an unspoken understanding, one they had seen before. Two young black women daring to stand tall in a place that was never meant for them. At the center of it all sat Judge Whitmore, an aging man with thinning white hair and a gaze that carried generations of entitlement. His black robe draped over him like a shroud, his pale fingers drumming impatiently against his desk. He had been presiding over this courtroom for over 2 decades, and his reputation was no secret. Beneath the mask of professionalism, his biases were razor-sharp, and his disdain for people like Ayanna and Amara was never too well hidden. With a sigh of exaggerated annoyance, he leaned forward, narrowing his eyes at the twins. "Miss Brooks and Miss Brooks," he said, dragging out their names as though they were difficult to pronounce. "What an unusual sight! 2 sisters standing side by side in my courtroom." He smirked, his expression laced with condescension. "Tell me, do you two always do everything together? Or just when you are causing trouble?" A few chuckles echoed from the jury box, though they quickly faded under the weight of Ayanna's cold stare. The judge's words were a challenge, a test to see how far he could push them before they cracked. Amara, the slightly more composed of the two, took a slow breath and spoke first. "Your Honor, we are here because of an unjust accusation." Unjust?" The judge scoffed, cutting her off before she could finish. "Miss Brooks, if I had a dime for every time I heard someone claim they were innocent, I would be a very wealthy man." His lips curled into a smirk, eyes scanning them as though he were enjoying himself. "Tell me, do you two always play the victim card, or is this a special occasion?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The tension was rising, though neither sister flinched. Ayanna, the more outspoken of the two, tilted her head slightly, studying the judge the way a lion might observe its prey. There was no immediate anger in her eyes, no visible frustration, just a slow, calculating awareness. "With all due respect, Your Honor, we are not here to play anything," she said smoothly, her voice even. "We are here to ensure that justice is served." The room fell silent for a fraction of a second, as if everyone was waiting for the judge's response. Whitmore let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair. "Justice?" he repeated mockingly. "You two are quite amusing." He shifted forward again, resting his elbows on the bench as he studied them with exaggerated curiosity. "Tell me something. Where exactly did you learn this confidence?" Certainly not from the neighborhood you grew up in. There it was, the subtle, insidious attack, carefully veiled behind humor. The assumption that because they were black, they must have come from struggle, from poverty, from a place that did not teach them dignity. This time, Ayanna and Amara exchanged a glance, silent, knowing, the kind of glance only twins could share. A flicker of understanding passed between them, an entire conversation unspoken. Amara smiled first. It was small, almost imperceptible. Then Ayanna, and that was when the first shift in power happened. "Actually, Your Honor," Amara said calmly, taking a small step forward, "we were raised with discipline, order, strength." Ayanna followed suit, mirroring her sister's step. "And we'd learned those things from our training," she added, her voice just as composed. Judge Whitmore arched a brow, unimpressed. "Training?" he snorted. "What are you talking about? Some local self-defense classes?" Amara let out a soft chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Something like that," she mused. Ayanna clasped her hands in front of her, her expression still unreadable, but with a bit more intensity. The judge squinted, clearly trying to understand what they were implying. The rest of the courtroom had fallen into an unsettling quiet, the audience hanging on to every word. Even the bailiff, who had remained stoic throughout the proceedings, now shifted uncomfortably. "More intensity," Whitmore repeated. His voice was still laced with arrogance, but there was something else beneath it now. A flicker of doubt. "And where exactly did you receive this so-called training?" Ayanna and Amara exchanged one last glance before Ayanna spoke, her words clear and deliberate. "The United States Army, Your Honor." A stillness settled over the courtroom, a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. For the first time, Judge Whitmore hesitated. His smirk faltered. His fingers, which had been casually drumming against his desk, stilled. Someone in the jury gasped. The court stenographer looked up, eyes wide. The judge scoffed, though it was noticeably weaker than before. "Excuse me?" Amara nodded, her gaze locked onto his. "You heard correctly, Your Honor." Ayanna leaned slightly forward. "Specialized combat training, reconnaissance, marksmanship." She smiled, slow and deliberate. "But of course, we would not want to bore you with the details." The room was frozen, the balance of power shifting in real time, and for the first time in his long career, Judge Whitmore found himself speechless. Judge Whitmore's smirk had vanished. The courtroom remained eerily silent, save for the faint rustling of papers and the distant sound of footsteps echoing from the hallway outside. The judge, a man accustomed to absolute control, now found himself staring at the two women before him with something he had not expected to feel: uncertainty. For a long, weighted moment, he simply studied them, as if searching for a way to regain his dominance. His fingers twitched, his lips parted, but no words came. The tension in the room had shifted. It was no longer the judge looking down on two black women he assumed to be powerless. It was two highly trained soldiers looking back at a man who suddenly felt exposed. Ayanna and Amara stood firm, their expressions unreadable, yet their presence was undeniable. And in that moment, Whitmore was no longer presiding over two defendants. He was facing something much bigger. The bailiff, a towering man with a hardened face, cleared his throat and shifted uneasily. He had worked with Whitmore for years, seen his theatrics, witnessed his treatment of countless defendants, especially those who looked like Ayanna and Amara. But this was different. One of the jurors, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a pearl necklace, crossed her arms, her gaze darting between the twins and the judge. "The army," she finally said, her voice uncertain. "Are they serious?" Amara turned her attention to the jury box, her eyes meeting the woman's. "Very," Ayanna nodded. "And if you are wondering whether we served or if we are just using the title for show, feel free to ask about our deployments." Another juror, a balding man in his 50s, shifted in his seat. What kind of deployments? Ayana smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The kind that would make most people lose sleep at night. The weight of her words settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. Whitmore finally snapped out of his silence, shaking his head as if dismissing the moment. "This is irrelevant," he said sharply, his voice regaining its usual edge. "Your military history does not change the fact that you are here because of criminal allegations." There it was, the attempt to seize control again, the attempt to reduce them back to what he had initially seen them as. Ayana and Amara had seen men like Whitmore before. They had seen them in war zones, in government offices, in training camps where power and privilege dictated who gave the orders and who followed them. The way he carried himself, the way he spoke, the way he dismissed their words, it was all so familiar. And yet, neither of them wavered. As Whitmore leaned forward, preparing to launch into a tirade, Amara's mind drifted for a brief second, back to a moment years ago. 7 years earlier, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The rain poured relentlessly, turning the training grounds into a pit of mud and sweat. Amara's muscles screamed in protest as she pushed herself up for what felt like the 100th time. Next to her, Ayana gritted her teeth, her arms trembling as she completed another set of push-ups. "Move, Brooks, move!" Their drill sergeant's voice thundered through the rain. Amara felt the weight of exhaustion pressing against her, but then she heard her sister's voice, steady despite the strain. "Do not stop now, Amara. We finish this together." She stole a glance at Ayana, who was just as exhausted but refused to falter, and that was all Amara needed. She pushed herself harder, past the pain, past the fatigue. They were not supposed to make it this far. They had been told, subtly and sometimes directly, that women like them did not belong here, that they were too soft, too emotional, too weak. But here they were, by the time they finished the drill, collapsing onto the wet ground with their bodies aching, their sergeant crouched beside them, his usual scowl replaced with something else. "Respect. Brooks twins," he muttered. "You two are going to be a problem." It was the first time anyone had said it like a compliment. Present day. Courtroom, Amara blinked, snapping back to reality as she heard Whitmore's voice cutting through her thoughts. "You two seem awfully confident for people facing serious allegations," the judge sneered. "I would be careful not to mistake arrogance for strength." Ayana let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "And I would be careful not to mistake composure for arrogance." The judge's jaw tightened. "You think this is a game?" "No," Amara said calmly, "but you do." The room tensed again. The judge's face turned a shade darker, his frustration barely concealed. Before he could retaliate, the double doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and a man in a crisp suit walked in. He was tall, well-built, with sharp blue eyes that immediately scanned the room. Assistant District Attorney Michael Reynolds. He approached the prosecution's table, leaning down to whisper something to the lead prosecutor, who nodded before whispering back. The judge's impatience grew. "Mr. Reynolds, I trust this is an important interruption." Reynolds straightened, adjusting his tie. "Apologies, Your Honor, but I believe the court should be aware of some new information regarding the Brooks sisters." Ayana and Amara exchanged a glance. This was unexpected. Whitmore folded his hands together. "Enlighten us." Reynolds cleared his throat. "Your Honor, it has come to my attention that the defendants have higher security clearance than initially disclosed." A murmur spread through the room. Whitmore frowned. "What exactly does that mean?" Reynolds hesitated before answering. "It means, Your Honor, that we might not be in a position to judge them as easily as we thought." Silence. A tension unlike before settled over the courtroom, not one of ridicule, but of uncertainty, of fear. Ayana's lips twitched into the smallest smirk. Whitmore, however, was not amused. His grip on his gavel tightened, his authority slipping. Through his fingers. "We will take a brief recess," he announced abruptly, slamming the gavel down. "Court is adjourned." He stood and stormed out, his robe billowing behind him. As the room erupted into hushed whispers, Ayana and Amara remained still. They could feel it. The tides were shifting. But they also knew. This was only the beginning. The courtroom doors shut behind Judge Whitmore with a forceful thud, but the tension he left in his wake remained thick in the air. Ayana and Amara exchanged glances, silent, knowing. They had rattled him, but this was not victory. Not yet. The murmur of voices filled the room as jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The court stenographer tapped hesitantly on her machine, as if unsure whether she should keep recording. Even the bailiff, typically indifferent, now cast uncertain glances in their direction. Michael Reynolds, the assistant district attorney, was still standing, his sharp blue eyes locked onto the twins. His face remained neutral, but there was something in his posture, something calculating. Ayana leaned slightly toward her sister. "He knows something." Amara gave a slight nod. "He wants us to know that he knows." The prosecution's table was murmuring among themselves, likely trying to figure out how to regain control. Their case had been built on the assumption that Ayana and Amara were just like any other defendants who walked through these doors, easily dismissed, easily manipulated, but they had underestimated them, and they hated that. Just then, Reynolds stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor as he approached. He stopped at the defense table, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. "You two," he said, his voice even. "You are interesting." Ayana tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "That is one way to put it." Reynolds exhaled, as if debating how much to say. Finally, he glanced toward the door where Judge Whitmore had exited. "You should know," he said, lowering his voice. "He is not going to let this go." Amara's brow lifted. "Is that a warning or a threat?" Reynolds studied them for a long moment before shaking his head. "Neither," he said. "Just a fact." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The desert heat was unbearable, waves of it rising from the cracked earth like a living thing. Ayana crouched low, behind the ruins of a crumbling wall, gripping her rifle with steady hands. Her breath was slow and measured, her heart a controlled rhythm, despite the chaos unfolding. Around her, beside her, Amara pressed her back against the stone, listening to the radio transmission crackling in her earpiece. "Echo team, report. Do you have eyes on the target?" Ayana tapped her mic. "Target is moving, confirming identification now." Through her scope she saw him, a high-ranking insurgent surrounded by armed men. They had been tracking him for weeks, waiting for the right moment. One shot, that was all it would take. But something was wrong. Amara noticed it too. Her grip on her weapon tightened. "We need to abort," she murmured. Ayana hesitated. "We have the shot." "No," Amara said, eyes scanning the area. "It is too easy." And then they saw it. A trap, a barely visible wire stretched across the perimeter, connected to a concealed explosive. Had they advanced any further, they would have walked straight into it. Ayana exhaled sharply. "Good catch." Amara glanced at her, a knowing look passing between them. "Always trust your instincts," Amara had said back at base camp. "The moment you start second-guessing yourself is the moment you lose." That lesson had saved their lives, more than once, and it would again. The hallway was quiet, the polished floors reflecting the dull overhead lights. Ayana and Amara walked side by side, their footsteps synchronized, their movements controlled. Judge Whitmore was waiting for them. They had known he would be. He stood near his chambers, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The moment he saw them, He straightened, adjusting his robe as if preparing for battle. "You think you are clever, do you?" he said. Ayana met his gaze without hesitation. "I think we are prepared." Whitmore exhaled a sharp breath through his nose, his jaw clenching. "Let me be very clear," he said, voice dropping to a cold whisper. "I do not care what training you have had. I do not care what clearances you hold. In my courtroom I make the rules." Amara's lips curled slightly. "And what happens when the rules no longer protect you?" Whitmore's eyes darkened. "You are used to fighting battles with weapons. This is a different battlefield." Ayana took a step closer, her voice calm. "So is that why you are afraid?" Whitmore stiffened. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but they saw it. The flicker of doubt. The realization that they were not like the others he had silenced before. Before he could respond, the courtroom doors opened again, and a woman in a tailored navy suit stepped out. Natalie Pierce, a defense attorney with a reputation for tearing apart biased cases. She walked directly toward them, her heels clicking with purpose. "Ladies," she greeted, her tone cool but professional. Then she turned to Whitmore. "Your Honor." Whitmore's lip curled. "Pierce." Pierce smirked. "I believe you were just leaving." For a moment Whitmore did not move. Then, with a glare at Ayana and Amara, he turned sharply on his heel and disappeared into his chambers. Pierce exhaled, turning back to them. "I was just assigned to your case." Amara lifted a brow. "By who?" Pierce hesitated before answering. "Someone who does not want to see you railroaded." Ayana and Amara exchanged a glance. This was getting deeper than they had anticipated. Pierce folded her arms. "Whatever Whitmore has planned, you need to be ready. He is going to push harder." "Now," Ayana nodded. "Let him." Pierce studied them for a moment, then gave a small smile. "Good," she said. "Then let us make sure he regrets it." By the time court was back in session, the energy in the room had shifted. Whitmore had regained his composure. But there was a new level of calculation in his gaze. He had regrouped, and he was ready to strike. Pierce sat beside Ayana and Amara at the defense table, her presence alone commanding attention. "Your Honor," she began smoothly, "before we proceed, I would like to make a motion." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "A motion for what?" Pierce's smirk was sharp. "To dismiss." A collective murmur swept through the courtroom. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "On what grounds?" Pierce leaned forward slightly. "On the grounds that this entire case is built on the assumption that my clients are guilty before proven innocent." Whitmore let out a dry chuckle. "That is a bold claim." Pierce's expression remained unchanged. "So is assuming that their military history is irrelevant." The room tensed. Whitmore's fingers drummed against his desk. "This court does not operate on intimidation." Pierce's gaze remained steady. "Neither do my clients." Silence. For the first time since the trial began, Whitmore looked uncertain. Ayana and Amara could see it. He was running out of ways to control the narrative, and he knew it. The battle was far from over. But the tides had turned, and Whitmore, he was starting to drown. Ayana and Amara sat rigid at the defense table, their eyes locked on Judge Whitmore as he took his seat. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something different about him now, something cold and deliberate. The battle in the courtroom had transformed into something far more dangerous, and they could feel it. Pierce leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stay sharp. He is not done." Whitmore's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "We will proceed." The prosecution wasted no time. Reynolds, who had been quiet before, now took center stage, stepping forward with slow, deliberate movements. His confidence had returned, his presence commanding. He had something. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to submit new evidence," he announced. Pierce immediately stood. Objection. The prosecution cannot introduce new evidence at this stage. Whitmore barely glanced at her. Overruled. Ayana's fingers curled into fists beneath the table. They had expected retaliation, but not this quickly. Reynolds approached the jury box, his voice measured. The Brooks sisters have presented themselves as upstanding citizens, as decorated military veterans. But the truth is often more complicated. A thick file was handed to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. Whitmore flipped through the pages, nodding ever so slightly before turning his gaze to the defense. This, Reynolds continued, is a record of disciplinary actions against Ayana and Amara Brooks during their service. Incidents of insubordination, use of excessive force during interrogations, unofficial missions that violated protocol. He turned to the jury. And, most notably, one mission that resulted in civilian casualties. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Ayana's pulse pounded. Amara's jaw tightened. Pierce stood. This is a blatant attempt to discredit my clients based on classified and military records. How exactly did the prosecution obtain these? Whitmore leaned forward, his tone casual. Are you saying your clients have something to hide? The words were a trap, carefully placed, waiting for Ayana or Amara to react. Amara inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay composed. We have nothing to hide, Ayana said, her voice steady. But we are not on trial for our service records. We are on trial for a case built on false accusations. Reynolds turned back to the jury, his lips curling into a smug smile. And yet, it is relevant, is it not? Because it speaks to character, to intent. If these women were capable of violence in the past, what stops them from resorting to it now? Ayana's vision blurred at the edges. It was happening all over again, back in Afghanistan, when an operation had gone south, when civilians had been caught in crossfire, when the blame had been shifted onto them, because it was easier to sacrifice the black women than hold their superiors accountable. They had been cleared eventually, but the stain had never washed away. And now Whitmore and Reynolds were dragging it back to the surface, weaponizing their past against them. Pierce's voice cut through the noise. This is nothing but character assassination. And it is irrelevant to the case. Whitmore took his time before responding. Noted. Then he turned to Reynolds. Proceed. Pierce clenched her jaw, knowing there was nothing more she could do for now. Reynolds continued, his voice smooth. Ladies and gentlemen, these women are not heroes. They are trained killers, and killers, when cornered, will do anything to protect themselves. The jury watched, their expressions unreadable. Ayana's fingers twitched. Amara steadied herself with a deep breath. Whitmore's smirk returned. He was back in control, and he knew it. The trial continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Every word from Reynolds, every subtle remark from Whitmore, was meant to chip away at their credibility. The pressure mounted, and then the first real blow landed. We have a witness, Reynolds announced, his smile widening. Someone who can speak directly to the character of the Brooks sisters. The courtroom doors opened, and a man walked. In tall, broad-shouldered and familiar, Ayana's breath hitched. Amara's entire body stiffened, because standing before them was Colonel David Rourke, their former commanding officer, the man who had betrayed them. Ayana's stomach twisted into a knot. She had not seen him in years, not since the mission that had destroyed their reputations, the mission that had left them taking the fall while Rourke had walked away, untouched. He stepped onto the stand, his eyes unreadable. But Ayana knew better. She knew exactly why he was here, and she knew what he was about to do. Reynolds turned toward him, voice smooth. Colonel Rourke, you served as commanding officer over the defendants, correct? Rourke nodded. That is correct. Reynolds gestured toward Ayana and Amara. In your professional opinion, how would you describe them? Rourke hesitated. Then, finally, he spoke. They were dangerous. The words slammed into Ayana like a fist. A hush fell over the room. Amara's fingers dug into the edge of the table. Reynolds feigned concern. Dangerous? Rourke nodded. Highly skilled, exceptionally trained, but reckless. They were willing to bend the rules to accomplish their objectives, and in some cases, he exhaled as if pained. People got hurt. Amara's throat tightened. Ayana saw red. She could hear it. Whitmore's satisfaction. Reynolds' smug confidence. The way the jurors were listening too closely. Pierce stood. Objection. Speculation. Whitmore barely looked at her. Overruled, Reynolds continued. Colonel, in your time working with them, did you ever feel they lacked discipline? Rourke hesitated just long enough. At times, the words twisted like a knife. Amara's entire body burned with fury. She had bled for this country. She had followed orders, even when they were wrong. She had sacrificed. And now, he was here to bury them. Ayana clenched her fists. She needed to stay calm, to think, to see the next move before it happened. But Rourke was not finished. One mission in particular, he continued. The one in Afghanistan. Reynolds nodded as if he had been waiting for this. The mission that resulted in civilian deaths? Yes. Silence. Whitmore's voice was almost gleeful. And you are saying these women were responsible? Rourke's expression darkened. They pulled the trigger. The words echoed. Ayana barely breathed. Amara's pulse pounded. Because this was the moment they had feared. This was the moment where everything came crashing down. The trial was no longer about truth. It was about perception. And right now, the jury was looking at them like they were already guilty. Reynolds turned back to the jury, his voice steady, triumphant. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here are two women who believe they are above the law. They were trained to eliminate threats, and when backed into a corner, they react the same way they always have. He let the words settle before finishing. With violence, Ayana and Amara sat still, their faces unreadable, but inside they were drowning in fire. Rourke had just signed their fate, and unless they fought back, right now, they were going to lose everything. The walls were closing in, and the only way out was through. The courtroom felt like a noose tightening around Ayana and Amara's necks. Rourke's words had poisoned the air, and the jury was drinking it in. The man who had betrayed them before had done it again. Only this time, the stakes were even higher. Ayana's mind raced. This was not just about this trial anymore. This was about who controlled the narrative. Rourke had planted doubt, crafted an illusion of guilt that was dangerously convincing. And Judge Whitmore, he was enjoying every second of it. Amara's hands curled into fists. She could feel her sister's tension beside her, the silent war raging. In her mind, they had one shot at turning this around, but what was it then, just as all seemed lost? The doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. Gasps filled the air. A woman stepped inside, her presence commanding, unstoppable. Her dark navy suit was crisp, her heels clicking with authority. She carried a briefcase, and her ID badge, government-issued, hung from her blazer. The Department of Justice. The entire room fell into stunned silence. The woman walked straight toward the judge's bench, unfazed by the murmuring crowd. Her icy gaze met Whitmore's, and for the first time, the judge looked uncertain. "Excuse me," he barked. "Who the hell are you, and why are you interrupting my court?" She did not blink. "My name is Special Agent Veronica Hale, Department of Justice." She pulled a thick folder from her briefcase and placed it directly in front of him. "And as of this moment, this trial is no longer under your jurisdiction." Whitmore's entire body stiffened. The jury looked around in confusion. Even Reynolds, ever confident, had lost his smirk. Ayanna and Amara exchanged a glance. Something was happening. Whitmore's hands shook ever so slightly as he flipped through the folder. "I do not know what kind of game you are playing, but this is not a game," Hale interrupted sharply. "This is an investigation, and you, Judge Whitmore, are at the center of it." A stunned silence filled the room. Hale took a step back, letting her words sink in. "This trial is a fraud," she declared, her voice cutting through the stunned murmurs. "It was orchestrated, manipulated, and weaponized against the Brooks sisters for personal and political gain." Reynolds shot up from his seat. "Objection! This is highly irregular." Hale turned toward him with cold precision. "Sit down." Reynolds hesitated, but the weight of her authority was suffocating. Hale turned back to the judge. "Shall I explain, Your Honor? Or would you like to confess?" Whitmore said nothing. Hale exhaled, her expression unreadable. "Very well, then allow me to present the truth." She turned to the jury. The Brooks sisters were framed. Another wave of gasps. Pierce sat back, arms crossed, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. Hale continued, "The so-called evidence against them?" She lifted a page from the folder. "Doctored, planted, altered." She turned her gaze to the prosecution. "And we have the proof." Reynolds went pale, but Hale was not finished. She turned toward Rourke. "And as for your star witness?" She flipped to another document. "Colonel David Rourke is currently under federal investigation for falsifying military reports, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power." Rourke's face drained of color. The room erupted into chaos. Whitmore slammed his gavel down, but it no longer mattered. The illusion had shattered. Hale lifted another document. "Would you like to know how this all started?" She turned toward Ayanna and Amara. "Would you like to hear the real reason these women were targeted?" Ayanna's heart pounded. Hale continued, her voice unwavering. "It was never about justice." She said, "It was about control." She turned toward Whitmore. "And about you." The room fell into stunned silence. Whitmore's fingers twitched around his gavel. "What are you insinuating?" Hale stepped forward, unrelenting. "You have spent years manipulating cases, destroying careers, targeting minorities, all to maintain your power." She turned toward the jury. "And now he has been caught." Reynolds shook his head, his voice desperate. "This is absurd. There is no proof." Hale lifted a USB drive. "We have everything," she said. She placed it on the judge's bench. A full record of bribes, altered rulings, suppressed evidence. "And of course," she turned toward Rourke, "your little deal with Colonel Rourke to use this trial as a way to settle old scores." Amara's stomach twisted. Ayanna's fists clenched. They had known something was off. But this was bigger than they had imagined. Whitmore's face was red with rage. "You have no authority to—" Hale pulled out another folder. "This," she interrupted, "is your indictment." The courtroom exploded. Jurors whispered in shock. Spectators gasped. Whitmore's mask crumbled. Reynolds, desperate, turned toward the judge. "You cannot let her—" "Enough!" Whitmore snapped, but he was losing control. Ayanna leaned in toward Amara. "We are winning." Amara exhaled slowly. "Not yet." Hale turned back to Whitmore, delivering the final blow. "You are officially removed from this case," she declared. The final crack in Whitmore's control snapped. He slammed his gavel down one last time, face twisted in fury. "This court is adjourned." And with that, he was done. The bailiffs moved forward. Whitmore did not fight them. He knew. Reynolds staggered back, his own fate uncertain. And Rourke, He did not move. The walls had caved in on him too. Ayana and Amara sat still, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then, slowly, they stood. Pierce smiled. "Told you he would regret it." The tension in their chests finally began to ease. For the first time, the weight was lifting, and as Whitmore was led away, his empire crumbling, Ayana and Amara exchanged a final, knowing glance. This fight was over. But the war had just begun. The weight that had pressed down on Ayana and Amara for months was finally lifting, as Judge Whitmore was escorted from the courtroom, his face contorted in fury. The air around them felt different, charged with a new energy, a shift in power. For the first time since the trial had begun, the twins felt free. They stood together, unshaken despite the storm they had endured. The jurors whispered among themselves, their previous skepticism now replaced with realization. Reporters who had once written damning articles against them scrambled to capture every moment, their cameras flashing like lightning in the crowded room. Pierce adjusted her blazer, watching Whitmore disappear behind the courtroom doors with a satisfied smirk. "Well," she said, exhaling, "that was a show." Amara turned to Hale, the Department of Justice agent who had changed everything with her arrival. "You had all this evidence. Why wait until now?" Hale closed the file in her hands and studied them with quiet admiration. "Because I needed to see how far they were willing to go," she admitted, "and I needed everyone in this room to see it too." Ayana nodded, understanding the strategy. "You wanted them to hang themselves." Hale smirked. "And they did." Reynolds, the once smug prosecutor, sat frozen in place, his skin pale as the reality of the situation settled in. His career had been tied to Whitmore's, and now he was on sinking ground. Pierce turned to him, her tone mockingly polite. "Mr. Reynolds, I believe you have some resignation papers to write." Reynolds didn't respond, his hands shaking as he reached for his briefcase. The fall of poor, powerful men was never graceful. As the courtroom emptied, a wave of supporters waited for the twins in the hallway. People they had never met, shaking their hands, thanking them for standing up, for fighting back. A few had tears in their eyes, other black veterans, young women who had been dismissed, activists who had been fighting battles like this for years. "This is bigger than us," Amara murmured to Ayana, watching the crowd. Ayana nodded. It always was. The trial had exposed more than corruption. It had unveiled a system built to crush those who refused to stay silent. And now, that system was crumbling. 1 month later. The air in Washington, D.C. was crisp as Ayana and Amara walked up the steps of a federal building, their postures as strong as ever. Their military past had taught them discipline, endurance, and resilience, but now they were entering a different battlefield, one that required strategy and reform. Pierce had called it a victory, but the twins knew better. This was just the beginning. Hale met them at the entrance, her presence as commanding as before. She handed them 2 visitor badges and led them through security. "You are making waves," she said, as they walked through the marble hallways. "People are listening." "They should be," Ayana said. Amara added, "because we are not done talking." Inside a conference room, a group of officials sat waiting. Department of Justice representatives, military advocates, even a few senators who had taken an interest. In their case, reforms were coming, and Ayana and Amara were going to make sure of it. Meanwhile, Whitmore sat alone in a cold prison cell, his hands gripping the edge of the metal table. The world outside was moving, without him. And for the first time in his life, he had no control, no power, no protection. His name, once respected, feared, was now a cautionary tale. The system he had manipulated for decades had turned on him. And as he stared at the cement walls around him, he realized something terrifying. This was his new reality. 1 year later, the spotlight had not faded, if anything. The fire had only grown stronger. Ayana and Amara now stood before a packed auditorium, their images displayed on screens behind them. They had been invited to speak, not as victims, but as leaders, as forces of change. Amara took the mic first. For years, we were told to be quiet, to follow orders, to accept the rules as they were. She scanned the crowd. But what happens when those rules are designed to break you? Cash, Ayana stepped forward. You rewrite them. The audience erupted in applause. They had won a battle. But the fight was far from over. There were more systems to dismantle, more voices to amplify, more battles to face. But one thing was certain, they were ready. No,